Welcome to Calumet Roundtable, the student-produced and student-run interviewing show here at Purdue Calumet. I'm your host, Lee Artz. I'm a professor of media studies. I'm joined by my guest, Alan Spector, who is a professor of sociology. Dr. Spector has written widely on the social consequences of globalization and neoliberalism. He's been assessing the crises of capitalism and its human costs. He's published in leading journals and books. He teaches and writes on social change and social justice, especially race relations and social movements. Welcome, Dr. Spector.
Well, nice to have this opportunity.
You, in the last few years, have visited several countries, and I wanted to talk a little bit about that. I understand you've been to Senegal on the east coast of Africa, Tanzania on the west coast of Africa, and to India, an emerging capitalist country in West Africa. I just wanted to start by asking you to talk a little bit about what sociologists say is stratification, which is a word I struggle with, and I think it kind of hides what the world is. I'd like you to explain to us, what does the social class as a lens contribute to our understanding of how society works? In Tanzania or Senegal, how can we understand social class in countries like that?
Well, one thing I think it's really important to understand is that the way we frame questions affects the way we understand them. So, for example, the word building could mean a thing. It could also mean a process. You're building something. And if we see stratification as a process, rather than seeing it as a map of where people are and who is where, then we get a better understanding of where we came from and where we're going.
So why would we want to look at a country like Tanzania or India using a social class perspective? What does it contribute to our understanding?
Well, just to be a little cantankerous, I tend to use the word class rather than social class. But either way, let me backtrack and say it in different terms. I've only met one person named Latino in my whole life. When I was young, there was no such word as Latino. The man I know named Latino was Giuseppe Latino from southern Italy. He's not a Latino. The point I'm trying to make is that ethnicities are a result of your life experiences, and your life experiences certainly are very much shaped by your language, but they're also very much shaped by political economy. And it's the political economy that creates these different ethnic groups, that shapes them in ways that are much more flexible and complex than simply saying this person comes from this tradition. So ethnicities are created, merged together, and destroyed, and therefore we want to understand the process that gives rise to these different developments.
Okay, so you're not saying that ethnicities don't exist or that they don't matter. You're just saying that they matter in the context of larger social relations or socioeconomic relations?
Exactly. Obviously, the ethnicities matter because they affect people's thinking, and people act on the basis of their thoughts. But that in a core sense, the process that gives rise to that is not mainly psychological and not mainly cultural, but rather in a world of capitalism, the power of capital, the power of money is very, very strong.
So two things. I'd like you to explain what you mean by political economy, because I'm sure different people have different understandings. And in that context, maybe you could talk about how a political economy will affect our understanding or the experience of ethnicity, because I'm assuming there were multiple ethnic groups in Tanzania before capitalism showed up. So how does that affect how people understand their ethnicity and how they act that out in a capitalist society as opposed to a pre-capitalist society?
Well, I think it's important to understand how capitalism completely remade the world. Utterly steamrolled it. That's not to say that graduation ceremonies don't look medieval in some ways, or that the ceremonies in the Vatican don't look medieval, but the Catholic Church is a very capitalist enterprise now, and Purdue University has close relationships with large corporations. So it's framed in its core as being something that relates to the class structure. Class is not just a place. Class is a relationship. It's a process, and understanding it that way, we have much more of a dynamic understanding.
Relationship to what, to whom, among what?
Well, class isn't simply quantitative, that is upper, middle, and lower.
Yes.
Class is more related to how you make your money. Do you make your money primarily from your property ownership, or do you make it mainly from your labor? Obviously, everybody labors to some degree, and most people own some property. But usually one or the other defines what you're doing. And once class relationships are established in a society, like a monopoly game or any other game, there are certain, I don't want to say laws, but I'd say processes, patterns that unfold in certain usually predictable ways.
So people that work for a wage in the United States or people that work for a wage in Tanzania or India are all part of the same class.
I would say fundamentally they have more in common than Bill Gates has with a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant worker in the U.S. However, that doesn't necessarily mean they know it.
Right. So Bill Gates, his position in the economy is he owns a business, he makes profits from the work that multiple wage workers do. So you're saying he has more in common with somebody in India that's running a call center than he does with an American worker, even though the people in India may be Hindu speaking Punjab or some other language.
I would say in the core sense, but always remember that it's like the difference between weather and climate.
Yes.
Climate is the general pattern, but any given day things can be, predictable. You could have a capitalist who's humanistic, and you can have a working class person who's very selfish, obviously. And
ethnicities in that everyday experience can explode even among the different classes. So you'll have something like Ferguson where white workers don't necessarily understand the black experience, or you'll have something like Hindus and Buddhists in India in an ethnic conflict not understanding that they have more in common than the call center I was talking about.
Well, it's very complicated. In Bangladesh, for example, which is originally East Pakistan, the population there chose to go with their Bengali culture rather than their Islamic religion, at least that part of Islam that was associated with Pakistan. But that's not always the case. And if you look at something much more obvious, such as the breakup of Yugoslavia, you begin to see very clearly that there were outside hands guided by financial interests that played one group off against the other. So that happens quite a bit, and certainly that's the history of Africa, which was colonized by the Germans, the French, the Spanish, the Portuguese, and then basically the United States and the Dutch.
So we, moving from there to contemporary society, and like I mentioned before, Senegal, Tanzania, India, the United States. We don't live in a colonial world so much anymore as what you've called in some of your articles in what's popularly known as neoliberalism. So what does that do to the experience, the social and cultural experience of these different ethnic groups, whether it's working class or not? What does neoliberalism do to our life?
Well, basically, the Soviet Union, when it existed, by the 1980s, really wasn't most people's model of a just and fair society. But its mere existence posed as a counterbalance to the US and Europe's ability to do whatever it wanted all over the world. So when the Soviet Union collapsed and became much more capitalistic, they basically joined in, but particularly stepped back, and the field became wide open. No longer could countries like Ghana, or for that matter, Yugoslavia, Romania, play one off against the other. And at that point, a lot of them shrugged their shoulders and just opened up their doors for the quick gain that they could get from big financial investments. But the big financial investments, of course, often impoverish large numbers of people at the bottom of the ladder in those countries, even as they do allow a so-called middle class to develop.
Okay. We're going to take a break here in a couple of minutes, so I'm going to ask you a question, but we can carry it over to after the break. Okay, could you give some components of neoliberalism, like 2 or 3 components of how we understand this? Because it's such a catchword in the media. So.
Okay. Well, for starters, liberalism in the U.S. has a different meaning than everywhere else in the world. In the U.S., it tends to be associated with what the rest of the world would call social democracy or welfare state or soft socialism. But in the rest of the world, liberalism was always associated with let the capitalists do what they want. And that is liberal for the capitalist class. And the neoliberalism simply means that there's been a stronger resurgence of that mentality in the last 20 years or so, as there have been a massive infusion of investments by the U.S., by Europe, and more recently by China and even India in those countries which we used to call the third world.
I'm glad you made the point that liberalism is, or liberal is understood differently. But one of the understandings I have is when they talk about reforms, to liberalize reforms essentially means to remove the regulation, to be more open, which means there is less public interest or public control or any public regulation. Is that a key component of what you're saying is neoliberalism?
Well, again, it's confusing because in the U.S., liberalism is associated with more government regulation. Right. Yeah. But in most of the rest of the world, liberalism meant allowing the companies to do what they wanted, and neoliberalism is, again, a stronger, sharper resurgence of that mentality and that policy in the last 20 years or so. And that's exactly what's happened. Why would countries allow that to happen? Because these countries are stratified by class. And the upper classes in those countries have a lot to gain from these investments, even if it means that the lower income people are being driven off their land so that China can buy farmland in Ethiopia for profit purposes.
Okay, hold that thought. We'll come back and talk about private and public interests in a minute. We're going to take a quick commercial break. Calumet Roundtable will be right back. Welcome back to Calumet Roundtable. I'm your host, Lee Artz. I'm a professor of media studies, and today my guest is Dr. Alan Spector, who's a professor of sociology. We've been talking a bit about neoliberalism and the social consequences of globalization. Many of your writings and your concerns are not just academic, but you're actually interested in social movements and social justice. So I just wanted to ask you about your experience in Senegal, Tanzania, India, or you don't have to leave them to that. Is the public response to this neoliberal resurgence of opening everything to capitalist investment, is it simply one of bad feelings, oh, what can we do, we're stuck, or has there been also a resurgence, or can you identify organized resistance or social movements to defend the public interest?
Well, there are social movements to defend the public interest, but they're generally still fairly scattered. I think that, again, from my point of view, the project started by Marx and Engels. Whatever good or bad people think came out of it, it was based on the idea that there's such a thing as human progress and that the world can move forward. And the collapse of most of all those experiments now, even Cuba is building resort hotels, the collapse of these experiments created a certain demoralization, as if somebody got hit on the side of the head with a baseball bat. It takes a minute for people to get their bearings again. So there's a lot of resistance on the local level. Sometimes the resistance takes a form, as it is in much of Latin America, of siding with one group of softer capitalists against the other group of harsher capitalists. But things are still in a state of flux. It's much more like the world possibly was in the 1890s, a decade or two before there was another world war.
I'm the host, so I can't get in it completely, but when I think of what the New York Times writes or the Washington Post writes, and they talk about the pink tide in Latin America, it strikes me that it's more than just a modest choose your capitalists. But some of the gains that the social movements and the working class have made in Venezuela or Bolivia seem to go well beyond just a resistant to actually offering, with all their faults, a possible alternative where, profits from natural gas or oil are used for public education or housing or healthcare or fishing rights or other things.
No, there's no doubt that on a material level, there are certain social democratic movements that spread the wealth more among the people that are poor. But the fundamental question is the global processes. And we already see now that the price of oil has dropped, new crises emerging in a lot of those countries. So that in the end, all those solutions are not going to be able to be lasting because the power of the capitalist class to marshal its forces and concentrate its attack on any opposition at this point is still very, very powerful. But I don't know, it's redundant, but anyway.
But that sounds to me, I mean, I'm hearing an echo of the argument that Thatcher or Reagan or others made. There is no alternative. Are you suggesting that there is no alternative? Because
oh, goodness, no.
I mean, that was part of what was. So, okay, the capitalist class has some resources. They're able to send arms to Syria. They want to send arms to the Ukraine. But on the other hand, you've got Syriza in Greece, you've got Podemos in Spain, you've got the Venezuelan Socialist Party.
Right.
I mean, you could make a long list of people that are resisting.
Well, that's why I said 1890s. You also had Germany with social welfare programs, and you had the Second International that for a time was pushing forward a lot of social democratic welfare programs. And then you had a world war, and then you had a Russian Revolution. There's a lot of genuine grassroots resistance. Okay. I certainly would never say that the masses of people that go, the working class people that go out on the streets in Venezuela and Bolivia and Ecuador, that somehow or some way they are willing tools of the European Union. That's crazy. But on the other hand, my point was, if I could use a phrase from Karl Marx, he talked about class in itself and class for itself. And at this point, the reality is that many of these grassroots movements are still grappling with how to emerge together to form more militant types of movements that can truly defend their gains in the long run. That's all I'm saying. I think, an optimist isn't someone who says things are going to be great. The real optimist is someone who stares right in the face at how difficult things will be and then still believes that things will turn out okay.
Yeah. Speaking for the human spirit, I guess. I'd like to come back to some of your travels because
sure.
part of what you're saying, and even to refer back to Marx, he says sometimes the best way to understand capitalism in the center is to see how it functions at the periphery. So while I'm referencing the Venezuelan social movements and Bolivian social movements, you were in Tanzania, Senegal, and India, and I just wondered if your experiences there over the past several years contributes to a better understanding of what the response to neoliberalism or globalization might be. Were there specific instances in Senegal or Tanzania that gave you hope for the future or suggested there was going to be resistance?
Well, when you talk to people on a one-to-one basis, you get a very different response. I mean, I was in Ghana some years ago, and whenever an American goes to one of those countries, everybody is so nice, and that's why people come back saying they must love America over there. When you ride into town with a $100 bill and a gun in the other, everybody's going to be nice to you. Yeah. And when I made it clear that I was a critic of, I use the word imperialism, it's an old-fashioned word, but I like it, that I'm a critic of the way that the wealthy countries invest money and extract profits from the poorer countries, then they smile and they tell me what they really think. In Ghana, they said, we're angry that the British took our gold, but in a way, we're lucky because we have nothing the West wants anymore, so they're not coming in here with lots of guns, arming different tribal groups and getting us to kill each other. That sounds kind of cynical, but those are the words out of the mouths of this one Ghanaian working class person. So the fact is that the media makes a big deal out of the rising middle classes in places like China and India in particular. But the poverty of the people at the bottom is unspeakable. China has 120 million migrant workers who move from place to place. You're not allowed to buy a house in the city. You're considered a so-called illegal alien, to use that horrible term they use here, if you move from the countryside to the city without a permit. And in India, the caste system and the anti-Muslim attitudes, and there's a third group that's very severely discriminated against, the indigenous people, called the Adivasi, who basically are the so-called scheduled tribes people that live in the Northeast, which is where there's a huge armed guerrilla movement taking place now. I think the leadership of that movement is misguided, but I think that the fact that that movement exists and has taken root is very significant. It means that there are people willing to resist, and they're just trying to find ways to do it effectively. I would never say that the power of capitalism is all-powerful. The economy in the U.S. almost collapsed a few years ago, and that's not just like some crazy statement made by somebody on the internet. It really was very close to bending to a point where it would break, and it wouldn't be so easy to put back together again. So there are lots of conflicts, lots of contradictions in the world. I'll cut short my last comment, which is that on this question, which is the more I travel to find answers, the more I realize how much I don't know.
This is what I'd like you to end with then. This is Black History Month. Malcolm X took a Hajj to Mecca. When he came back, he had a different understanding of capitalism, class, and how the world worked. And I just wondered, I'm not suggesting that you did a Hajj or that I'll call you El Hajj Allen, but going to Tanzania or going to Senegal, did that aid or does that help us understand something like what happened in Ferguson? Is your experience in Senegal and Tanzania, and we have a couple minutes for a...
Sure. Well, I'll roll back even to my first trip to Ghana, where my daughter was working there for a couple of years, and then a trip to Zambia as well. The conservative response, many conservatives' response to looking at the class stratification and poverty is one of, there's something wrong with those poor people.
Right.
Many well-meaning liberals' response is, it's too bad these poor people are like a bunch of sick puppies, but we must do something to help them out. What I came away with was a tremendous admiration for the resiliency and the strength, of what people can do with duct tape, baling wire, corrugated plastic, sheets of plywood, and just tremendous ingenuity, power, never quitting, people dealing with the death of children and then just getting on with their lives, people scratching the ground. To me, this is not a cause for feeling sorry for people, but is one of really understanding their admiration. And what was distinctive about Ferguson as well is it's very similar in a way, because the initial killing in Ferguson was actually probably less grotesque than what's happened in many other places. There was a killing in Gary, a young boy shot in the back of the head while he was running from the police. And there was one of an autistic boy who was shot dead in his own house in Calumet City, 2 blocks from here. There were not big uproars. What was important about Ferguson is that people basically, partly maybe spurred on by Trayvon Martin or by disillusionment with Obama or just the general buildup of the economy, a combination of factors, but the people had their limit. In other words, no matter how many times you burn down the prairie, the grass grows back. Yeah. And that's what I get from these travels. The people never quit.
Thank you. I would just make a closing remark that whatever you can do with your duct tape or your baling wire or the other things, imagine what the working class could do if they had access to the steel and the chemicals and the energy resources.
And the laboratories.
And the laboratories. That's all the time we have on our program. Thank you, Dr. Spector, for joining us today to have a discussion. I hope you can return. I'm your host, Lee Artz. Have a great day, and we'll see you on the next roundtable.